I had always believed that the most disturbing stories lived in the brittle pages of forgotten books. As a child growing up in the Midwest, I would hide under my blankets with a flashlight and thumb through yellowed paperbacks, imagining ancient secrets hidden between the lines. But what I found last autumn, in a quiet, brick-lined library in a small New England town, was something altogether different. It wasn't a story that had been crafted and rewritten and edited for effect. It was a testament, a handwritten account spanning decades, slipped between the pages of a geological survey, left for someone, anyone, to find. It was a record of a place people swore did not exist, and a warning that seemed to reach across the years to me specifically. I did not mean to steal it. I had been researching a project on vanished towns when I pulled down the old survey and found the leather-bound notebook wedged inside. The leather was soft with age, the spine cracking when I opened it. The first page had a name scrawled across it: Edith Hartwell, 1901. The ink had faded, and the cursive slanted elegantly, as though written by a hand trained to write slowly and carefully. Beneath the name was a note in a different hand, written later, perhaps decades later. If you read this, you must tell someone, so that Black Hollow is never forgotten. I read those words in the silent reading room, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly watched. The notebook was not a formal journal. Sometimes Edith wrote daily, sometimes weeks or months would pass between entries. Sometimes the handwriting was neat and precise, sometimes the ink wavered and the letters trailed off as though written by a trembling hand. The entries began in May of 1901 with a simple explanation. Edith had taken a teaching position in a place she called Black Hollow. She was to be the school teacher for the children of a community hidden away in a mountain valley somewhere in the Appalachian Range. She did not specify in which state, perhaps intentionally. "They do not welcome outsiders," she wrote. "I was chosen only because my uncle knows a man who knows a man, and even then I had to promise to keep their secrets." The first few entries were ordinary enough. Edith described her journey along narrow, winding roads, the horse-drawn wagons slipping over muddy ruts. She wrote about the cool, damp air of the forest and the way sunlight became thin and pale beneath the canopy. She mentioned the driver, Mr. Stone, who spoke little but glanced over his shoulder often. "We passed 3 streams and a fallen chestnut tree," she noted, as though leaving directions in case she needed to find her way back. On the second night, they camped beside a creek, and she heard something moving in the underbrush. "I thought it was a deer," she wrote. Mr. Stone did not speak, but he loaded his rifle and kept watch until dawn. It was the 4th entry that chilled me. "We arrived at Black Hollow," Edith wrote. "Though they call it that, it is not a hollow in the usual sense. It is a valley, wide and green, hidden by mountains that seem to fold over it like hands. The air is thick with fog. It smells faintly of wet stone and something sweet, like overripe fruit." The children stared at me from behind their mothers' skirts. No one spoke except a tall man with pale hair and dark eyes. He introduced himself as Reverend Abel. She described the town. A cluster of wooden houses clustered around a church, a schoolhouse built from dark logs, and fields stretching to the foot of the mountains. There was no road in or out, only the track she had taken with Mr. Stone. She noted that there were no cemetery stones in sight. "I asked about burials," she wrote. "Mrs. Riker, who made me tea, said they have no graves here." She laughed when she said it, though there was no humor in her voice. The early entries spoke of school lessons and homesickness. Edith missed her family and the bustle of city life. She taught children their letters and numbers. She described the way the fog would roll into the valley in the late afternoon, and how, when it thickened, the townspeople would retreat into their homes, pulling thick curtains over the windows. "They tell me not to look outside when the fog comes," she wrote. "They say the fog plays tricks on the eyes, that one might see things that are not there and yet are." I asked Reverend Abel, and he smiled kindly and said, "There are old things here, older than you and me. The fog keeps them out." I'm not sure whether he was joking. As I turned the pages, the air in the library seemed to grow colder. I forgot where I was, the dull hum of the fluorescent lights fading, until all I could hear was the scratch of Edith's pen across paper. She wrote of strange songs she heard at night, low humming rising from the fields, as if many voices were singing in unison just beyond her window. Once, she woke to find muddy handprints on her doorstep. Another time, she caught a glimpse of someone standing in the fog outside her classroom during lessons. But when she opened the door, there was no one there, only the fog and the echo of children's whispers. Gradually, the tone of the entries changed. In October of that year, she wrote at length about the Harvest Festival, a celebration held after the last crops were brought in. "They danced until dawn," she wrote. "They lit a fire in the clearing, and each person took a handful of corn and threw it into the flames. They were singing in a language I did not recognize. I asked Abel what it meant, and he said, 'It is older than English and older than the valley, yet it means the same as all our prayers, that the fog may stay where it belongs.'" Then, a week later, she wrote, "There is a man in the fog. I've seen him twice now. He wears no hat, though it is cold, and he has no lantern. His face is pale, almost luminous. He stands just at the edge of where the fog thickens, and he watches the village. No one else has spoken of him. When I asked Mrs. Riker, she pressed her finger to my lips and said, 'Do not name the hollows whisper.'" Throughout the winter, the entries became sporadic. Edith wrote of dreamless sleep, and then of nights when she could not rest. "I hear footsteps on my porch," she wrote. "I wake to find my hair damp with dew, though my windows are closed. The children are restless. They look exhausted, their eyes ringed with gray. When I ask them, they say they hear singing from beneath the floorboards. Abel says the winter fog is thickest, and we must ignore it." She began to refer to the older ones. These were not elders in the town, but something else entirely. "There are others here," she wrote. "I feel them when I stand in the doorway of the schoolhouse. The air grows heavy as if a storm is coming, but the sky is clear. The fog curls around the foundation stones. Sometimes when I am alone, I hear my name whispered by a voice I do not recognize. I went to the church, and Abel prayed with me. He said the older ones live in the hollows between our worlds. He said they do not wish us harm if we follow the old ways." The journal entries for the spring of 1902 were few, but they were disturbing. Edith wrote about 3 children who went missing. "They were playing by the creek," she wrote. "Mrs. Riker told them not to go beyond the second bend, but they did. When we searched, we found only their shoes. There were no footprints leading away, only the fog swirling over the water. The mothers did not cry. They stood in the church, their faces carved like wood. Abel said the hollow took them." I felt the hair on my arms rise as I read this. Edith did not mention the children again. The final entries of 1902 were frantic, written in a hurried hand. "It is as though the valley itself is turning against us," she wrote. "The crops fail. The animals are restless. Last night, I woke to hear someone whispering outside my window. I thought it was a child, but when I opened the door, I saw Abel standing in the fog, his eyes closed, his lips moving silently. He did not acknowledge me." In July of that year, Edith attempted to leave. "I packed a bag," she wrote. "I told no one. I waited until midday when the fog was thin, and I walked quickly down the path we had taken to enter the valley. But after an hour, I found myself back at the schoolhouse. I do not know how. The forest seemed to rearrange itself around me. The trees were not as I remembered. The sun seemed to move too quickly, and then it was evening, and the fog rolled in heavy and wet. Around this time, the handwriting changed. It became shaky, the lines wavering. "I've lost track of the days," she wrote. "The fog lasts longer now. The older ones are near. The people have grown quiet. They look to Abel for guidance, but he too seems lost. He speaks in that old language more often. When he looks at me, I feel he sees something over my shoulder."
The entries after this were spaced out by months. Each seemed written in a different mood, sometimes hopeful, sometimes resigned. In 1903, she wrote, "It has been 3 months since I last wrote. We had a thaw and the creek ran high. The fog cleared for a week. It was the first time I have seen clear across the valley. There are ruins at the far end, stones covered in moss. I asked about them, but no one would speak." Later that year, she wrote of a fire in the church. "It started in the rafters," she wrote. "The entire town gathered to fight it. Abel carried out the altar himself. Afterward, they rebuilt the roof, replacing charred beams. I asked if the older ones had been angered by something. Abel told me not to speak of them." The final entry written by Edith, dated October 31st, 1904, was brief. "There are footsteps outside as I write. They do not sound human. The fog is thick tonight. I see lights moving in it, though we have no lanterns lit. The singing is louder than ever. If I do not write again, please know I tried. There are things in the mountains that should never be woken." After that, there was a blank page, and then another handwriting, bolder, more modern. The new hand belonged to someone named Michael, and the date was 1967. He wrote, "I found this journal beneath a flagstone in what remains of Black Hollow's schoolhouse. There is little left, stones, rotted wood, and the bell, which lies half buried in the earth. I came because I heard stories of a lost valley where people vanished. I thought it was just folklore. It is not. I camped near the creek. At night, the fog comes from everywhere at once. I heard singing. I saw pale lights moving in the trees. I saw a face in the fog. It was not the face of any creature I know. I am leaving at dawn and will never return. If you read this, do not seek Black Hollow." The next entry was dated 1987 and was signed simply R.J. "The valley is real," they wrote. "We hiked in under clear skies. By midday, the fog rolled in. We thought we could find our way back by compass. The needle spun in circles. We heard water where there is no creek. We heard children laughing. We found the ruins, stones, charred timbers, the bell. We heard it ring, though it lay half in the mud. My friend Mark saw something in the fog. I dragged him away, but something held him. When I turned, he was gone. I do not know where the path out is. I write this in case someone finds it.
Do not come here. There were more entries after that, scattered across the years. Each bore witness to an attempt to find or escape the valley. Each told of fog that disoriented even the most prepared hikers, of voices calling to them in the night, of lights moving in unnatural patterns. Some mentioned a song, a low humming that resonated in the bones. Some mentioned the feeling of being watched by eyes that blinked once every few minutes, as though whatever owned them had no need to refresh them as we do. Each ended with a warning: leave if you can. Do not look back. When I looked up from the notebook, my eyes blurred, and the world seemed strangely quiet. The library was empty except for me and the humming of a distant heater. Outside, dusk had fallen. I should have returned the notebook to where I found it and walked away, but instead I slipped it into my bag. I told myself I would return it after reading it properly at home. I told myself I was only taking it so I could write about it, so I could honor the request on the title page to tell someone. The first night I had the notebook in my apartment, I woke to the sound of footsteps above my ceiling. I live on the top floor. The next night, as I was drifting to sleep, I heard a low humming, like many voices humming the same note. It seemed to come from the walls. When I opened the journal, the pages felt colder than the air. I began to have dreams of fog rolling down narrow streets, of children playing by a creek under a sky bruised purple with twilight. I saw a face in the fog, luminous and featureless, like the face Edith described. In my dream, it pressed itself against my window. When I woke, there was condensation on the glass in the outline of a hand. I spoke to my friend Lisa, who is a folklorist. She laughed when I told her about Black Hollow. Every region has its ghost towns, she said. There are always stories about lost settlements and strange lights. It is part of our national mythology. She told me about the Roanoke colony, about the Anasazi, about mining towns swallowed by forests. But she admitted she had never heard of Black Hollow. If it exists, she said, there should be some record. Land grants, letters, something. She promised to help me look, if only to prove it was just a story.
The next day, we went to the state archives. We combed through maps and land deeds. There was no mention of a place called Black Hollow. We found references to other hollows, Jumper's Hollow, Widow's Hollow, but not this one. We searched local newspapers from the early 1900s. There were reports of missing persons near certain mountains, rumors of hikers disappearing, but nothing concrete. It was as though Black Hollow had existed outside the record, its people never counted, its crops never taxed. One archived letter from 1931 came from a surveyor assigned to build a road through a mountain pass. He wrote that the fog was so thick that compasses spun uselessly. Workers heard singing and saw lights, and one man walked into the mist and vanished. In the end, he concluded the area was unsuitable for a road and noted that locals called it the hollow that whispers and warned that it should be left alone. We looked at one another and did not speak. After that, Lisa refused to continue researching with me. She suggested we burn the notebook or at least return it. I could not bring myself to do either. Instead, I began reading the entries at night, as if by returning to them, I could unravel the mystery. Each time I read, I felt a pull, as though the valley itself were tugging at the corners of my mind. I began to smell wet stone and overripe fruit in my apartment. Fog formed along the baseboards, even on clear nights when the stars shone sharp in the sky. Over the following weeks, the pull of the journal grew stronger, and I realized patterns in its pages. The fog was always thickest in October. Those who tried to leave alone disappeared, and sometimes the valley would release a single person who carried a small token
a stone, or a page, as if the place needed to let something go to stay balanced. As I read, I found a loose page tucked near the back, wedged between the covers. It had no date, no signature. The handwriting was shaky and unfamiliar, but there was something desperate in the slant of the letters. It said, "The fog is not what you think. It does not drift in from outside. It rises up from below. It comes from what lies beneath the valley. It is not a barrier, it is a veil. When the veil lifts, they see us. When it falls, they can touch us. Do not breathe deep when the fog thickens. It will fill your lungs with dreams." That night, the humming rose until it shook the walls. I opened the journal and saw the ink smearing as if still wet, and my fingers tingled where it stained them. I closed the notebook, resolved to return it to the library and to tell the story later, and fell asleep with the humming like a lullaby. In my dream, I stood in the ruined schoolhouse, fog curling around my ankles. Edith stood in the doorway and whispered, "They are behind you." When I turned, I saw tall, featureless shapes moving like reeds in water before I woke in a panic. The journal was not on my nightstand. Panic gripped me. I ran to my living room, my kitchen, my bathroom, searching. It was nowhere. I stood in the center of my apartment and realized the humming had stopped. There was only silence. I felt a chill and then a warmth on my hand. When I looked down, my fingertips were stained with ink again. On the wall opposite me, words were appearing, written in the same ink, as though invisible hands were writing them. The words said, "It is moving." Then they faded, leaving the wall clean. I did not sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I went to the library with shaking hands, clutching my bag, though the journal was no longer inside. I walked to the shelf where I had found the geological survey, hoping beyond reason that the notebook would somehow be there, returned by whatever had taken it. The survey was there, dusty and untouched. I pulled it down, opened it, and found the journal exactly where I had left it weeks before. The leather felt warm under my fingers. I did not question how it had gotten there. I only knew I needed to put it back and leave. I slid it into place, pushed the book back onto the shelf, and stepped away. I felt a weight lift, not entirely, but enough. I walked out of the library into the bright morning, the air crisp and clear. Yet, as I turned the corner and stepped into the sunshine, I saw, just for a moment, a tendril of fog curling at the edge of the street where there should have been none. I blinked, and it was gone. A child laughed somewhere nearby. The sound echoed off the brick buildings. It sounded like the laughter Edith had described, carried on a century of air.
I have told no one else in my life about this in detail, so I am writing it here for whoever finds this and wonders whether the hollow that whispers is more than a campfire tale. It is real in the way that some places are more idea than coordinates, a confluence of fear and something older than any of us. Do not seek it. If you hear singing from the fog in the mountains, turn back. If you find a notebook hidden in a library, resist the urge to read. Some stories do not want to be known, and some places exist only when you think of them. 2 weeks after I returned the journal, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single line in an old-fashioned hand. "You told someone. Good." That night, the humming returned, growing louder. I thought of Edith, Abel, the children, and all the others who had held that leather book. I tried not to think of what might be rising with the fog, but as I write these final words,
the humming begins anew. If you see fog where there should be none, if you smell wet stone and overripe fruit, if you hear a sound that vibrates in your bones, remember this story and walk away. Sometimes I still hear the bell from that forgotten schoolhouse ringing faintly, and I wonder whether Edith left. There is a whisper carried by the fog that says, "We are all just visitors to their world." Maybe the older ones are not evil, but lonely, reaching out in the only way they know.